whether it's smoke-free workplaces or ending all tobacco sales. All of these things start at the local level.
Today, Jim Knox shares key insights from decades of experience on the front lines of public health and sheds light on the evolving tactics of the tobacco industry.
Who's got the power?
I just want them to stop targeting us.
Cotton candy.
What do you mean it ain't flavor?
My father died of smoking-related illness.
Change in this country has always been a result of people speaking up against injustices.
Welcome to Take 10 to Take Down Big Tobacco. This podcast was created by the California Tobacco Endgame Center for Organizing and Engagement, a project of the American Heart Association, and is designed for the local health heroes and coalitions taking on big tobacco. In this podcast, we set aside 10 minutes to hear how those in the organizing community are working to end the tobacco epidemic. I'm Shannon Lujan, and thanks for joining. Welcome to today's podcast. We're excited to have Jim Knox with us. Jim has over 40 years of experience in nonprofit public interest advocacy. Most recently, he served for over 2 decades as the managing director for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, or ACS-CAN, leading advocacy efforts in California and Hawaii. Jim is also a graduate of Stanford University and holds a master's in public policy. Let's dive into his wealth of experience and insights today. Hey, thanks for being here, Jim.
Thank you, Shannon.
We're really excited to have you. Speaking of decades of experience, you've been at the forefront of some important tobacco policy changes and events over the last 20 years. I mean, what do you think are the most significant milestones and what makes them important?
Well, there's certainly been a bunch of them. California has a history of being a tobacco control trailblazer. We've established groundbreaking tobacco policies that have spread to other states and other nations. California was the first to use revenue from a tobacco tax to actually fund a comprehensive program to reduce smoking. We were the first to ban smoking in the workplace and in bars and restaurants. California was one of the first states to raise the age for tobacco purchase from 18 to 21. Hawaii beat us by about 6 months. And California voters passed the largest tobacco tax increase in the nation's history in 2016. More recently, California, along with Massachusetts, became the first states to ban the sale of flavored tobacco products. So all of these policies, born in California, have shaped tobacco control movement worldwide and saved millions of lives and saved billions of dollars in healthcare costs.
The fact that California has been the first for so many of these policies, it really speaks to the leader that California has been on this front, a trailblazer, as you say, lots of successes. But let's take a look at the current state of tobacco. How has their tactics evolved over the years, both politically and in the way they conduct themselves in the consumer marketplace?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid the tobacco industry isn't going away. They are relentlessly innovative and they have unlimited resources, But basically, there are 3 battlefields on which we fight the tobacco industry: the marketplace, the legislature, and the courts. The marketplace is probably where we've seen the biggest change in the industry. They've diversified into different types of products like e-cigarettes and synthetic nicotine pouches and produced, new, slightly different products to try to skirt the flavored tobacco ban, which has forced us into kind of a whack-a-mole battle. And I suspect that marketplace innovations are going to continue. For example, I'd be surprised if the traditional tobacco industry doesn't capture the cannabis market once it becomes legal nationwide. Now, the second venue, the legislature, tobacco industry continues to be a major campaign contributor. There was a time when the tobacco industry was the single largest contributor to the Republican Party. I don't know if that's still true, but most Republicans in the state legislature in California do take tobacco contributions. In recent years, there was a time when we were able to shame the Democrats into not taking tobacco money. But I see from the campaign reports from the most recent election, many Democrats are once again accepting tobacco money. So, there are a few tobacco bills in the legislature this year. It does remain to be seen how active the industry is going to be in opposing them. The third venue is the courts. Anytime tobacco industry loses in the legislative venue, they're going to challenge it in the courts. They've got so much money. There's no reason not to challenge it. If nothing else, sometimes they can get a delay on the implementation of these laws. We saw that with the flavored tobacco ban. They challenged the law in court and lost. And then they challenged some of the attorney general's decisions whether specific products are flavored or not. And later this year, under legislation we got passed last year, the attorney general will be publishing a comprehensive unflavored tobacco list, which we hope is going to make it clear once and for all what's flavored and what isn't. If your product's not on the list, you won't be able to sell in California. But again, I'd be surprised if the industry doesn't challenge this in court, when the AG releases it, and at least try to slow down the process. And that'll impede enforcement. So those three venues, we're continue to be actively fighting the tobacco industry, and they are a formidable foe.
Yes, Jim, it does make sense to be prepared on those three fronts. And like you said, it is a challenge because they have unlimited amounts of resources that they can access. But there has been some success, such as raising the tobacco purchase age to 21, plugging loopholes in the state smoke-free workplace law, the passage of Proposition 56, and the passage of legislation to prohibit the sale of nearly all flavored tobacco products, and new enforcement measures to enable effective local implementation of that law. Yet these changes in law, it doesn't seem to be slowing the industry down. The industry keeps churning out new products like these menthol cigarettes to undermine the flavors law and to flood the market with new nicotine products aimed at youth. So I guess the question that we have is, what will it take to truly take down big tobacco and stop the tobacco epidemic?
Well, you're right, Shannon. There have been many really important victories, but the tobacco industry is relentlessly innovative and nimble. They have unlimited resources. With access to exceptional marketing skills and capacity, limitless campaign contributions, and the best lawyers that money can buy. So I expect the industry is going to continue to create innovative new products that we're going to have to fight. Like we've seen with the menthol cigarettes and the synthetic nicotine pouches, and I suspect someday cannabis. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to completely take down the tobacco industry, but with constant vigilance, perhaps we can minimize its impact.
So, looking toward the future, what does the end game look like in California? And what is your take on the drive to eliminate retail sales of tobacco products at the city, the county, or even the state level?
Yeah, it's complicated and I think an uphill battle. I don't think there's much appetite in the state legislature to ban the sale of all tobacco products. I think it would be hard to maybe even find an author to introduce such a bill, much less get 41 votes in the Assembly, 21 in the Senate, and the governor willing to sign it. So I think that's an uphill battle. I mean, I think right now there are two cities in California that have ended the sale of commercial tobacco: Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach. And that was quite a few years ago. I think it was back in 2021. So there hasn't been a whole lot of momentum. And I think it's going to take a lot more jurisdictions to adopt local laws, probably several dozen before the idea might become viable in the legislature. But I mean, kind of taking a broader view, my personal view is that the notion of end game, as I think most people think of it, that is banning the sale of all commercial tobacco products, is a bit narrowly focused. The marketplace is much more complicated now. The issue is not just cigars and cigarettes and chewing tobacco. There are a whole raft of products in the marketplace now, which make this much more complicated. You've got e-cigarettes, hookah, cannabis, hemp, synthetics, and potential combinations of all of the above that make this environment so much more complicated now. And if we were able to ban the sale of commercial tobacco products, will that simply drive up cannabis use? And is that a public victory if that happens? I think this is a real challenge for the tobacco control community, because I think we really need to get a better handle on what to do about cannabis and the interplay with other tobacco products. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think we can just pretend that the problem doesn't exist.
Absolutely. And with all these changes, people are really looking to the local level. Do you think that, as you're talking about these policies, do you think that these policies will pass in significant numbers and that tobacco sales will be severely restricted? Or Is there a long road ahead? And is that the ultimate solution? Or should we focus on other strategies to reduce their impact?
I think it's going to be a challenge. I think there's going to have to be more progress at the local level. That's definitely where it has to start. But in the meantime, I don't think we can ignore the other pieces of the puzzle that need to be dealt with both at the state and the local level.
Thank you, Jim. You've brought up a lot of things to consider, lots of points. What do you think is the next big tobacco policy on the horizon?
A few things come to mind. I think most immediately, enforcement is really a big issue that needs more attention. There's no point in having great state and local tobacco control laws in place if they're not enforced. And this is particularly true of our state and local bans on flavored tobacco. To begin with, too many cities and counties in California don't even require a tobacco retailer to have a license. This is the first step in controlling tobacco. And of those cities and counties that do require licenses, relatively few of them require annual inspections, the key to enforcement. And too many cities and counties fail to set their annual license fees high enough to pay for that enforcement. So it becomes a low priority and it doesn't get done. And at the state level, the same thing. The annual license fee to sell tobacco is way too low. It's only $265 a year. That's enough to inspect only 8% of the tobacco retailers in California. But at the state level, I think, honestly, most importantly, we need to raise the tobacco tax. Increasing the tobacco tax by a significant amount has proven over and over again to be the most effective way to reduce tobacco consumption. Unfortunately, the California legislature historically has not been willing to do that. Of the current $2.87 tax per pack, all but 12 cents has come from 3 citizen ballot initiatives. The legislature has raised tobacco tax only once in the past 55 years. And that was a paltry 2 cents to fund to fund breast cancer research back in 1994. So this is a challenge, but I think it's one that can't be ignored. And finally, I think perhaps the biggest challenge is how are we going to deal with all the coming tobacco hybrid products and potential cannabis products that threaten to make smoking cool again? How are we going to fight off the backsliding on the cultural norm that we have worked so hard to establish? It's taken decades to make anti-smoking a cultural norm. And I think we're in real danger of losing ground in the current environment with so many different types of products that is making tobacco, smoking, and nicotine, cool.
You're right. All that work that has been done on the cultural shift is losing some ground. And there are many tobacco prevention advocates all across the state of California still in this fight. What advice would you give to them?
Well, I think the most important thing is to engage at the local level. That's really where you can have the most impact. It's tangible. You can see it in your communities. Local advocates know their elected officials better than their state officials, typically, and federal officials. So, you see them in the supermarket and around town. And getting policies passed at the local level has always been the key to moving important tobacco control legislation in California and nationwide. That's where it's always started, whether it's smoke-free workplaces or ending all tobacco sales. All of these things start at the local level. That's where we need to engage to make progress at the state and federal level.
Hey, thanks so much for being here, Jim.
It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Shannon.
For more information about this subject and other advocacy resources, go to organizingtoendtobacco.org. And don't forget to follow us on social media. I hope you found this discussion insightful and enjoyed our exploration of today's topic. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us through our website or social media channels, and be sure to share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. Until next time, thanks for joining. This program is copyright of the California Tobacco Endgame Center for Organizing and Engagement, a project of the American Heart Association, with funding from the California Tobacco Prevention Program. The opinions expressed by the speakers in this podcast are their own and not necessarily those of the Tobacco Endgame Center, California Tobacco Prevention Program, or the American Heart Association. For more information, visit organizingtoendtobacco.org.